Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. Secretary Nielsen, we're delighted and honored to have you here with us today to share your perspective on many different topics, including threats affecting the public and private sector. I know that the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, the agency that you headed up, was originally formed in response to the 9/11 terrorist attack, but its mission went way beyond just physical attacks from terrorists, particularly in the area of cyber. And for the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in the number and sophistication of cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. This includes things like data breaches, ransomware, and in some cases, even destructive wiperware. These attacks have cost billions of dollars to businesses, government agencies, school districts, and other critical infrastructures here in the US and even around the world. There is also growing geopolitical strife that is impacting businesses worldwide. So I thought to begin with, let's start with the nation state threats. I think the invasion of Ukraine started first in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, and that resulted in Russian cyber attacks that spilled over against the West, including NotPetya in 2018. More recently, since the February 2022 Russian invasion, there have been increased attacks against Western countries that supported sanctions against Russia. There are also continued threats from Iran against the Middle East and the US. I remember the first destructive malware attack against Saudi Aramco was one of the first examples of destructive malware. There were some others, but that was the one that comes to mind. Iran also was behind the 2012 and 2013 distributed denial of service attacks against US banks. Then, of course, there's North Korea. We knew that North Korea was behind the attack against Sony Pictures, which happened in September of 2014. But we didn't know until an FBI bulletin released in December of 2014 that year that this attack was not just about exfiltration of sensitive data and emails. It also included malware that wiped data, systems, backups, and devices to the point that Sony Pictures had to deploy all new systems and devices and actually couldn't produce financials for up to 6 months. Last but not least is the threat from China against US businesses for purposes of commercial espionage, which really continues today, despite Xi's pledge to stop such activity. So I guess for you, Madam Secretary, I have questions about the nation state threats. I mean, a couple questions are really tied together, but how would you set the current threat priority to these nation states?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to see you. And I'm such a big fan of what you do, both at BRC, but also more broadly at GRF. So thank you. It's a very, very important, as you know better than anyone, to have partners like you. So thank you. Yeah, there's a lot going on, right? It's kind of like lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, is sort of where we are with nation states. I'm trying to think of how to best parse it. I mean, at the top level, I think China is the most strategic and probably most comprehensive threat. We see them waiting, we see them embedding, and, certainly as we all still try to understand the implications of Volt Typhoon, that's what we see them doing, is waiting within our critical infrastructure systems. We've had the DNI recently suggest that perhaps that was intended to pre-position cyber attacks against infrastructure to disrupt communications between the US and Asia. And we certainly see China continuing to hoover up data, right, wherever they can find it. We've had, Director Wray, I might not get the exact stat right, but, he said that China has stolen more of Americans' personal and corporate data than every nation combined. So it's quite a strategic threat. And then, of course, on the military side, they've continued to probe, air defense identification zones. They also are the most active and persistent threat to government as well as critical infrastructure. So I think China, I would rank them as the most strategic, sort of long-term threat. Russia obviously is probably the primary threat to our interests in Europe. We see Ukraine being a test bed of tactics. We saw the tactics that Russia used previously on Estonia. There's cyber attacks. There's also all of the pro-Russian propaganda, which continues to proliferate. And then on the physical side, of course, they have the world's largest nuclear arsenal. So we have physical and cyber threats. Iran, interest in the Middle East, they're openly hostile. We're seeing the Iran-backed proxies very active, obviously Hamas, but we're also seeing Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Islamic resistance in Syria and Iraq, their development of ballistic missiles. The ODNI recently opined that they expect Iran to continue to pursue opportunistic offensive cyber. So we still have to worry about Iran with cyber as well. And then when you get to North Korea, you mentioned Sony, you mentioned some of the other attacks emanating from there. I think they're still focused on cryptocurrency heist. I mean, they seem to think of cyber warfare more as guerrilla warfare against its adversaries. I wouldn't rank them in terms of capability or strategic threat from a cyber perspective as high as the other ones. Of course, we do see them more and more active right now. Leader Kim just oversaw some rocket drills in April that simulated a nuclear counterattack. So I think they're rattling the saber more and more. The last thing I would just say is I think what we have to watch as a business community, though, is more of the alliance between the countries. We had Kim and Putin meet again today. They met September last year. That's more concerning, how Russia, North Korea, China, Iran are starting to work together, cooperate in political, military affairs. So there's a lot happening there.
Yeah, that you bring up a point, and I'm concerned about this BRICS nations. That's the acronym for Brazil, Russia, Iran, China, and South Africa. And they've expanded to include India, Egypt, Ethiopia, and UAE. Now, their stated goal, I think, is to establish deeper ties between the member nations and cooperate on economic expansion, including trade. But their underlying goal is to counterbalance Western influence and kind of an implied threat to the West from a broader geopolitical perspective. Any thoughts on this BRICS?
Yeah, I think it's one to watch, right? I mean, as you point out, it doubled in size this year.
Yeah.
So, I think, the underlying goal of counterbalancing Western influence, yes, yes, and yes. But it's starting to look more like an, explicit, as others have commented, G7 grouping, right? I mean, there are some heavily sanctioned regimes that now form BRICS. The potential for a BRICS currency, you're hearing more and more of the leaders talk about that on the outskirts of BRICS meetings. Currently, obviously, the international system is still dominated by the US dollar, but that would pose potential severe disruption to the way that international markets work. I think we also have to watch for the creation of the new development bank as an alternative lender to the World Bank. And then, things like Enbridge, new wholesale central digital currency. All these things are just, it would, I don't want to overplay it, but it would certainly present a very different playing field than we have today. So I think businesses would be smart to watch the developments. I don't think that there's going to be a new currency tomorrow. I don't think this is a very near horizon threat. But I do think it's something to watch. And I do think the morphing alignments between these countries with respect and vis-a-vis to their position on the US is something we should all be watching.
Yeah, you talked, we've talked about BRICS, we talked a little about China as maybe the biggest threat. And we think and we've talked some about cyber capabilities of China and their global influence. They're also expanding their global influence in nations around the world. For instance, they have a strategy of deep sea mining and preserving dominion over rare earth elements. And I think about the push we have toward EV and other types of reducing carbon in the atmosphere and going with more electric cars and trucks and other capabilities. They're almost building a monopoly around that. They're also building infrastructure in Africa to tie down rights and relationships there. I don't know if you've studied this, but is the U.S. going to be left behind when it comes to issues like deep sea mining and land-based mining of rare earth minerals?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a complicated question for a variety of reasons. As you say, lithium, cobalt, graphite, these are all things that are needed for components for EV batteries, wind turbines, sort of almost all of the alternative energy technologies that are coming online and expanding. Mining and land has already occurring, as you mentioned, but this deep sea floor is, it raises a lot of concerns. First of all, we don't yet know what it would do to the environment. So there's a concern there for marine life, excuse me, and just sort of the health of the oceans and the interplay of ecosystems. But geopolitically, we've had Norway and Nauru come forward and say, look, we want to do this. And then you've had the UN sort of belatedly, through the International Seabed Authority say, okay, well, we're going to come up with regulations by 2025, we'll have some more meetings. But this is a classic example of, will an international regime be able to really either slow or control and govern something that is way outside of the boundaries, geopolitical boundaries, but also actual geographical boundaries of countries. So I think, it also raises concerns for me about the Arctic. We really should be paying a lot more attention. The Coast Guard has a role there, and they're doing all they can to get the resources and authorities they need, including more icebreakers and national security cutters. But we need to increase our position there, not just for the potential of sea lanes, but also for these issues of mining. So it's just something else to watch, because it could give other countries, but particularly China, a huge advantage if they are able to continue to monopolize some of these minerals that we need for all of these emerging technologies.
Well, a little bit, you did mention our Houthi rebels and just the recent impacts of them attacking shipping lanes. I mean, we saw during COVID, massive disruption to supply chains, and now we have, shipping lanes being attacked and ships having to go, all the way around Africa to get to the Mediterranean, and vice versa to Asia. And we've seen other types of disruption from nature or man-made incidents that could impact supply chains around the world. What should the U.S. be doing from a policy perspective to try to insulate critical components, like, for instance, chip manufacturing, for example, from overseas threats?
Yeah, supply chains, I mean, well before COVID, DHS was very focused on supply chains, both from a component perspective, as well as really looking at where we have concentrated dependencies and where we really need to ensure that we have supply of very unique goods. DHS has always looked at it as well from a contractor supply chain perspective, right? We vet the first tier contractors quite extensively, but who are the subcontractors? And when you think about supply chain of services, not just products, how can we ensure that we're not introducing threats and vulnerabilities into the system? I think the good news is that there's so much happening. The challenge with that is always, will things make it through the noise and be able to make a difference? But with the creation of the White House Council on Supply Chain Resiliency, Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force, DoD has some new strategies coming on board. I think there's a renewed and certainly increased focus on this, which from a policy perspective is what you need, because you need all of the whole of government interagency partners working together so that we can really identify where the weaknesses are in the chains, and then use things like the Defense Production Act to work on it. I think the Chips and Science Act will be very important as we look, towards what do we do with the semiconductor race. And I'm hopeful on that. DOJ is looking at different ways to think about antitrust. CFIUS is always looking at ways to protect our supply chain in terms of making sure what we have in the United States is able to continue to produce in the United States, is not owned by foreign ownership that might at some point become adverse to our interests. But there's a lot there, and I think companies really need to do their homework. This is an area where you, as a company, really need to be sure who your suppliers are, who your clients are as well, for that matter, because you can have a reverse supply chain problem if for some reason all of your clients disappear or go offline because of another disruption somewhere else. But companies should be thinking through alternatives, redundancies. I mean, at the heart of it, this is a resilience problem because there's only so much that an individual country or company can control. So the best way to look at this is sort of a system of systems approach, just like we do security, in layers, and think about how can we ensure that we have what we need. And part and parcel of that, it just in any security problem, right? Risk management is figuring out what are the keys to providing whatever it is that you do, whether it's a product or service, and then going from there and mapping it out. So I guess what I would say is there's good news and bad news there. It's more of a challenge than it ever was before. We all saw the vulnerabilities during COVID, very particular to PPE and other supplies in the medical arena. But there's more that we need to do. So I think we have to keep the eye on that and then make sure that the companies are really planning sufficiently for any kind of disruption.
So you see a role for government in addressing some of this. I know there is some concern about are we becoming a smack of protectionism if we secure U.S. trade from foreign manufacturers. I was thinking about Nippon Steel buying U.S. steel, and you mentioned other major enterprises, critical to supply chain of companies, but also the military and the need to be cautious. And I know a major military contractor was, you have to find out who your supplier is and their supplier and their supplier.
Right. Right. No, that's right. But you have to do that because otherwise you don't really know what it is that you have.
Yeah, exactly.
Without.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think with the steel, gosh, it's a tough one. I mean, the president has come out in speeches and said, generally speaking, he's not in favor. I don't think he's necessarily indicated a hard pass, but he's indicated that there are some concerns there, and we need to make sure that any company, not just Nippon, would do what we would want them to do in terms of securing our access to the steel. But also, there's employment issues, there's union issues, making sure that different agreements and contracts with the companies are upheld by any potential buyer. CFIUS is obviously reviewing it. The Justice Department, recently has asked for some additional information, is my understanding, on the antitrust side. So it's an interesting example because we haven't really had such a major M&A deal squashed in quite some time. So as the pieces fall into place here, it's probably more likely that protections would be put in place to ensure that we have access and that our supply is resilient. But so things could be uncovered by CFIUS or an antitrust process that makes that not possible. In which case, I would imagine that both bodies would make recommendations and then take actions that are within their authorities to recommend various approaches to the president. So we'll have to watch that one. I mean, the employees themselves seem to be largely in favor of it by news reports. So, you're balancing that as well. Shareholders, many of the shareholders are in favor as well because they are offering quite a premium. But there's a lot of other concerns. So balancing all those, I think, just shows the complexity of our world today. It's not just one thing. It's many things that go into analysis of these sorts of transactions.
Well, yeah, and the promise to modernize the steel mills, I think that goes a long way in keeping jobs and that certainly will win over the workers and the investors. Kind of related to this, at GRF, we've done several exercises on various scenarios, and one was, I guess I'll call it an incursion by China against Taiwan, and the ultimate incursion, and then the subsequent supply chain issues that would result. And we've done some other exercises. We actually just completed two virtual tabletop exercises that involved over 700 banks and credit unions.
Wow.
And we tested their operational resilience and ability, what we call restore minimum viable service levels. And that's defined based on a project we started a couple of years ago, actually 3 years ago, called the Operational Resilience Framework. It was developed by industry experts in operational resilience and business continuity and information security, networking, a whole bunch of other fields. And we had finished that and actually gone through version 2.0, just completed last year. And this idea of minimum viable service levels resulting from a destructive attack against payment systems in the US. And we're also planning to follow up that exercise third quarter with a similar one involving a multi-sector attack. So it's not going to be just banks and credit unions impacted. It'll be, corporate America and school districts and government and everybody affected by this multi-sector attack. Kind of related again to payment systems, but we're going to stick to that. It's kind of common among all businesses, so we'd figure we'd go with that first. And what should I guess? Well, the overall question is too really: what role do exercises play in ensuring the ability of organizations to recover from a destructive attack and reach these minimum viable service levels? And we're not expecting you to be fully up and running from a destructive attack, okay? Probably unlikely, but to be able to reach those minimum viable service levels and are there other areas that we should be planning for and rehearsing from a risk management perspective? Not just we're picking on physical incursion, supply chain impact of Taiwan, especially with chip production, and then and this other one we're actually targeting payment systems that can be wiped at financial institutions and in corporate America. So are there other, I mean, first of all, what is the role of exercises important and how often should we be doing it? And I guess the other question is, are there any other areas that we should be planning for?
Yeah, first, just huge kudos. I'm a huge believer in exercises, operational exercises as well as tabletops. And I just, in my experience, we've had plans and plans and plans since 9/11, but it's not until you test them through an exercise, and hopefully you do it in exercise first, as opposed to some sort of disaster or emergency. But it's the only way to test, everything from the roles to the authorities, to the coordination mechanisms, the partnerships, availability of resources. We all assume we're going to have what we need when something happens, but that's often not the case. And you also often are not able to tease that out until you have a scenario that you're playing against. I also think it's the only way, I have been in many rooms where people fight the scenario during the exercise, right? Well, this could never happen. And
Right.
this wouldn't be this way, and we would be doing this other way. But if you can go with it, it also can serve a huge educational function, right? It's not just important to have the plans. It's really important for everyone to know what it is that everyone else expects them to do. And that's easy to say, oh, no, I know what to do. I know what to do. But again, when you have a scenario and you're playing it out, even if it's not real time, even if you're taking time jumps in the scenario, you really start to better understand what is expected of you. I think over the years, whether it's a national exercise, ones that you've been involved in, dating all the way back to FSISAC, we've identified single points of failure. This whole concept of concentrated dependencies that I talk a lot about. That is one of the best ways to really understand that, oh, wait, we're all going to assume that this is available to us. And then we realize that there's a very limited supply of that, whatever it is, whether it's a product or service or part of the supply chain. I would also say on the tail end, it's really important after an exercise is to really take the time to identify the observations and the lessons. I mean, the old expression, it's lessons observed, but we want it to be lessons learned. We need to really get that discipline in. In terms of what else you could do, I mean, first of all, those are fantastic scenarios that are multi-sector, multiplayer, international. I mean, you can just begin to imagine the cascading effects in either of the scenarios that you were just describing. But I think emerging threats in general, again, because it is a good way to also educate folks. So whether it's, whether we're talking about AI, whether we're talking about quantum, whether we're talking about, on the defense side, new and novel mechanisms for autonomous delivery systems. I would focus as well on emerging threats. As you know, I'm a big believer that if we look over the horizon, we're always going to be better prepared and, get forward on our toes and change our posture to lean forward. But I think crisis comms is another one that I find companies, certainly in the government, but companies tend to think they have that box checked. And it's not until you have a scenario that you realize, oh, wow, we did not get the messaging right. That would have caused X, Y, and Z likely. And now that we know that, if and when something like this actually happens, we'll be better prepared to communicate to our employees, to our stakeholders, to industry, to government, to all of the stakeholder set that you would need to communicate with. I also think it just establishes really important relationships, right? Another expression that we've all heard a million times is we don't want to exchange business cards during a disaster, but we really don't. So doing the exercises, meeting your counterparts, establishing relationships where on a day-to-day basis, you actually start sharing threat information. Tremendous benefits come from exercises that aren't just the exercise itself. So I would say keep doing it. The more, the better. There can be exercise fatigue. So, you can't do it every day. But I think having a regular schedule that people are aware of and they understand how to participate is very important, and bringing more people to the table as well.
I remember, this is maybe a little bit off topic, but I remember during Superstorm Sandy, that had a major impact to New York City, and we had a plan at FSISAC to respond to any major incident of national significance, and this was the guy that was in charge of it worked at a major financial institution. He was heading out on vacation. He said, well, we got the plan, follow the plan. And he went off on vacation. So we did it and it worked. The plan worked. We had daily calls. We produced a executive document out for the membership each night on what the status was with the stock market reopening was the big thing. It was, remember, they I think on Sunday night, I think they said they were going to or Sunday afternoon, they said they would be open on Monday. Sunday night, they changed their mind, and all of a sudden, stock market wasn't opening. So we said, "Oh my God!" So that was we learned by fire. But we also, I was very pleased with the amount of cooperation we got from other sectors like communications, like water, electrical sector. Everybody really cooperated and really kept us informed during that whole real event.
Right, which is what has to happen, right? Because everything is so interdependent that the sectors that you just can't, you literally cannot plan alone anymore, because you will not be able to provide minimum level or any level of your service without working with the other sectors. Internationally, we've also, right after 9/11, we had the CAP series of exercises, and we bring in international partners, and that made a big difference. But when I was secretary, we were doing exercises with our partners in the UK on very specific cyber scenarios around elections and disruptions. Extraordinarily helpful, because you just begin to understand at a much different level how things will actually play out and what the expectations of both countries are. So again, huge believer in exercises, and your multi-sector approach is spot on. It's the only way that makes sense.
Yeah, during your time as Secretary of DHS, am I correct that you actually created or was formed CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security?
Yeah.
It's formed under you? Okay. I thought it was. And that's, I mean, its main functions were responsibility for cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, really, I guess, across all levels of government, but also assisting the private sector organizations in addressing cybersecurity and other issues. And I think that was a big game changer. So I commend you for that. So I get to
But I appreciate that. I mean, it was a team effort. And I think what's surprising about that is it's just a perhaps a negative example of how the wheels of government just move so slowly. It took a long time, and others had tried before I came to DHS. But we needed new operational authorities. We did, and we needed ability to retrain and hire people, retain them. We also needed to have clear lanes in the road as to what DHS was responsible for vis-a-vis some of the other departments who were involved in cyber. So the creation of CISA was really sort of a monumental need at the time, and yet, chairman after chairman, elected official after elected official, was questioning, but do we really need to do this? And of course there was the joke at the time, was this just about changing the name of NPPD because nobody really understood what NPPD
yeah,
stood.
it did. Yeah.
But it was so much more
Sometimes.
than that, and it really was important. And I just remain so proud of the men and women at that agency, DHS at large, of course, but at CISA, because they've really stepped into the mission space in a way that's just sorely needed. So there's still a lot to be done there, but I think I don't know, just to give you some examples, I think the use of binding operational directives, which we did some when I was secretary, is very important to set sort of a threshold. I think the catalog of known and exploited vulnerabilities that DHS publishes has really increased the preparedness. I think some of their joint advisories with partners like the UK have made all the difference in raising awareness and helping companies prepare. And, for years, we've all talked about the need at DHS to be able to tailor intel to particular sectors, right? So, sending out an advisory that there is a threat from Russia, not helpful. If you're the energy sector, you really want to know, okay, but how is this going to affect my SCADA systems? What do I need to do differently with ICS, strategy moving forward? And I think DHS has really enabled partners to do that, and itself included. So when you look at, for example, the advisories that came out around Volt Typhoon, I mean, very specific guidance that companies should follow to protect themselves, to detect that or similar activity. And I just think that is really important. So there's still a lot to do. The mission space continues to morph. But CISA, is just doing such incredible work. So I think we all should continue to partner with them and let them know if there's an attack and what's happening, and then ask them for what we need. I mean, this should be a joint, two-way conversation.
Do you see anything missing? I mean, you started it, and you mentioned some of the things under your administration, and actually in the current administration they've done. Is there more that they could do to improve it, the public-private partnership in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think always, right? And that's not a reflection on the agency. That's just a reflection of the morphing environment in which we live and the speed at which technology is coming online. So, that whole concept of identifying the new and emerging threats before they are fully deployed in our environments is paramount. So making sure that they have the discipline throughout all of DHS, but to look at the emerging threats, identify them, and then match that to what are the needed capabilities and authorities, training, personnel, et cetera, that we need to assure that we can, address them. I think operationalizing, there's still a lot to be done there, just giving support to the private sector as a true operational partner. I know Jen Easterly continues to work on that, and that's very important. International negotiations, I would still like to see CISA have a much more prominent seat in all international negotiations, frankly. But at least the ones where we are talking to foreign governments about their nefarious or aggressive use of cyber against U.S. interests. So, often just the way bureaucracy works, the State Department takes lead. There's other departments who are involved, but DHS should really be part of that conversation, because we should never be trading away the importance of security, and particularly when it comes to cyber in this day and age with nation states. So I'd like to see them have more of a role, a bigger seat at the table. And then, back in 2018, I had announced the policy of DHS at the time was a policy of relentless resilience, a little bit of a mouthful there, but we got to continue to focus on that. What does that mean? We need to keep moving from being highly reactive to highly resistant. How do we really enforce our systems and networks, and how do we think about that? And some of that is stepping back to think about, how do we think about that? Are the 16 sectors the way that we should think about it? For example,
that's a good point. Critical infrastructure, is that the way to think about it, or is it some other formula? And some other countries don't have 16 critical infrastructures; they have 8 or 10 or whatever. So
yeah.
Does it really make a difference? Hey, you mentioned 2 areas: artificial intelligence and quantum computing, and I'm thinking about that. I know in quantum computing side, I know China has invested a lot of money into quantum computing, and we are in the U.S. to some extent, but isn't it mostly funded through grants to academia and some private sector companies? Is there more that the U.S. should be doing, investing in quantum computing to make sure we're competitive? And how will that change the corporate national security landscape, I guess, as that evolves?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that anybody knows the exact answer to who's ahead, because it depends on how you look at the problem. I mean,
Okay.
they do have more official funding, for sure.
Okay.
But on the other hand, we have a very active, private sector, technological innovation sector, if you will. We've got government labs, we've got many universities who are involved. And we also are working with quite a few of our allies. So when you try to compare it apples to apples, I'm not sure it works. But I do think that the United States needs to continue to push forward. Technology in my mind is never good nor bad. It's neutral, but it certainly can be used for good or bad. And so we need to continue to promote all of the many, many, many positive uses of quantum and quantum computing, quantum sensing, while also being very mindful of any potential vulnerabilities that might be introduced into the system. There's been some great legislation passed over the last couple of years. There's a bill drawn up by Congressman Stefanik and Blackburn. I'm trying to think what it's called. I think it's the Defense Quantum Acceleration Act, that would really push the Defense Department to have a center of excellence and to really focus more on advancing the priorities and missions of the department through quantum. That's really important. I mean, I really encourage, I think Senator, not sure, maybe it's Blackburn actually has introduced the companion bill in the Senate. We've got to urge the Senate to put it in the NDAA, which is where the House has put the House version, and we got to fund it in approps. But we need to take it seriously. It's a race like any others. The private sector is doing their part, but we need to continue to encourage the government to put the resources against it. And, it's also, without getting into too many of the technical aspects of it, but we need to think much more broadly. We have for a long time really focused on gate model solutions, and annealing and hybrid really offer quite a lot of benefits, with annealing being just far, far superior from an optimization perspective, at least with some of the research that is coming out. So, and that's of course before you get to quantum and AI. So there's more to do. I do feel confident the private sector is pulling that sled as quickly and as hard as they can. But I do think the government could do more to support that, and also to provide use cases. As we all know, technology sometimes is created in a vacuum, and you've got to have the frontline folks and the users have, in a conversation with them to tell them, these are the requirements. This is what we need this technology for, or here's a problem we don't know how to crack. Could that technology crack it? And that conversation is very important. And then that goes back to some of the public-private partnership groups, right? Being able to have those conversations and compare notes, so to speak, is really the best way to push any technology forward.
And the technology, you did mention AI a couple times there, but that's gotten a lot of attention lately. And yeah, I could definitely see AI best practices put out by CISA for cyber defense potentially. Maybe that might be an area, or other bulletins about AI as a social engineering and used by cyber criminals usage. That type of thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, and DHS is doing some of those. I think they just completed it, but they did a great series of webinars for the emergency services sector around AI. So they're pushing that, and on the increasing cyber attacks, the person who's called this out so well is Director Wray. Because he looks at it, I think the words that he uses is that AI takes the JV players and immediately makes them varsity. And so, we have it's a whole new slew of players who we now have to worry about once they are AI enabled. Gosh, I spend a lot of time talking about AI risk, how to identify it, how to manage it. The potential positive applications are exponential. But I think the new and evolving, attack surfaces, vulnerabilities, and risks are as well. Starting with, one of the biggest risks, I would say, from AI currently is just the fact that most potential users and the public writ large don't understand what it is and what it isn't. So for example, AI cannot tell you the truth. Right, it's not a concept that it has. It deals in probabilities, and it's based on the data that you feed it. But people go to Chat GPT and they ask it a question as if it can be a adjudicator of truth. It's not. That's not what it is, right? So you also find misuses of AI that can be dangerous contextually before you even get to all the ones we know, the gender and racial bias problems, the hallucinations, the lack of relevance, the deep fakes. I mean, the fake Pentagon explosion deep fake caused a real dip in stock market. It was momentary, and the responses were in place to say, no, this did not happen. But there was a moment in time where that deep fake was past enough muster that, folks trading in the stock market thought, wait a minute, whoa, what's happened? The Biden robocall fooled a lot of folks. And, the Hong Kong police have told us about, the finance worker who was tricked into paying, I think it was 25 million out to fraudsters because he participated in a video chat with colleagues. And it turned out that the video chat was a deep fake. So he recognized his colleagues and thought he was on a Zoom like this. But instead of Bill Nelson, it's a deep fake. And so, we have to worry about that. The faster digital attacks, I think. But, it's also the threats to AI. General Nakasone was talking a lot, and I'm sure he still does before he left, but about IP theft through AI. We know China spends a lot of time on IP theft from US businesses. But now with AI tools, it's that much easier to grab data. And also to poison, again, the threats to AI side, it's possible to poison the platform through changing and maneuvering the data that goes into the model. We've seen all kinds of prompt injection attacks already, and it's still, relatively on a curve here. So I think we have to really think about it. I could probably talk your ear off and I won't. Just a couple other examples, I think, from a defense perspective. And the Defense Department has been very aware and on top of this, including Space Force, calling for a pause of any AI system until they could kind of get their arms around it. I think we have to still have humans in the loop. We have to think about this very realistically and pragmatically. If we're talking about a lethal, autonomous weapon system, we still need a human in the loop. And that should just be something that we continue to abide by, as our Defense Department is. And when we look towards regulation, it's complicated. But what I will tell you is the bad guys are not going to wait for regulations. So we have to balance, any of these regulatory frameworks for emerging technology. You've got to balance the potential curb on innovation with the need for governance and the need for risk management. And there's lots of bills that are in the works, some of which have been introduced. We'll see where we end up, but we need to look at the users. We need to look at the use. We need to look at the data set. Bill was just introduced to give Commerce Department additional authority to impose export controls, which I think is super smart because, to the extent that we now develop the best and brightest AI systems, we also don't want them to go right out the door to other nation states' use. So a lot there, and NIST is doing a lot, of course. They've got their framework, and others are working on it, but this is a ripe area. There's so many uses for AI, but it can absolutely present new and novel vulnerabilities that we all should be aware of and be actively monitoring and managing.
Well, Madam Secretary, this has been very enlightening. I want to thank you for participating today. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience today?
No, again, my pleasure. As we all know, and we've probably said it ad nauseum, but Homeland Security is a team sport. So we need everyone pulling oars to get us going in the right direction. And again, just kudos to GRF. You really do play a very important role in the framework and networks of preparedness and information sharing and discussions and bringing us all to the table. So I thank you for that. But, at the risk of ending on a Debbie Downer note, I will just say we also have great technological opportunity to push the mission of Homeland forward, especially when it comes to emergency response and, understanding of disasters, helping folks train. I mean, there's so many positives that are happening. Hopefully DHS has the ability and authority to leverage them all. So a lot of good work to do too. We always have to watch that risk horizon and just make sure that we're ready.
Well, thank you for your leadership, and thank you very much for being here today. And look forward to your continue to work with you, and we look forward to your continued comments and thoughts going forward. Thank you very much, Madam
Oh,
Secretary.
my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.